Amity Shlaes, the chair of the board for the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, author of 4 New York Times bestsellers, including Great Society, A New History. Amity, great to talk with you again. Thanks so much for joining us this morning here on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah. So the protests, the George Floyd case, law enforcement, where do we start? I attended some of the protests yesterday, and I guess my reaction is, okay, I kept seeing these signs that say white silence equals violence. And so it just got me to think, okay, well, if white silence equals violence, well, then let's have a real conversation about the cities like the city George Floyd was killed in. What's your take?
Well, my take is don't be bullied, one. 2, we have a problem in cities, but everyone has to be able to speak on his or her own terms about what happened. We have tragic incidents with some police forces in some places. Let's try and fix that. Whether that requires an entire revolution in the United States, history suggests it does not. In the Great Society book, I look at a similarly idealistic period. And let's get this straight. We are all idealistic. We all have hope for perfection. And in the 60s, that's what we didn't say we wanted a good society. We said great society, no injustice anywhere, economic equality everywhere, which is going to come out of the current protests as well, a demand for that. And so we spent what turned out to be trillions over time trying to achieve that. We promised to cure poverty, C-U-R-E, cure. It didn't work. Most of the money we spent was inefficient, and some kind of enshackled people into generations of poverty by institutionalizing dependence. So that all comes out of the 60s. The word entitlement comes out of the 60s. So we did very, very much in the name of helping people through our love, and actually hurt many of them and wasted a lot of cash. What struck me looking back at the 60s when we needed something better was that the private sector actually helped recovery and made things better, and the public sector was less efficient at that. So right now, of course, the push is going to be towards government. The 60s record warned against expecting the federal government to save from troubles in towns.
What struck me at the protests that I walked through yesterday was at one point there was a pickup truck that drove down the street with a Donald Trump flag on the back of it. And so some of the mob in the protest rushed the vehicle, and I was a little nervous that things were going to get out of hand at that point because it looked like they were going to start attacking this vehicle and the people inside it. And there were people there with firearms ready to defend downtown businesses and things like that. But when that vehicle went down, some in the mob started chanting, F Donald Trump. And I couldn't help but think, wait a minute. I was like, you do realize that the city that George Floyd was killed in is run by Democrats. The city council, the department, the mayor, the state is run by Democrats. And you're out here saying F Donald Trump. Donald Trump, who delivered on criminal justice reform while Joe Biden voted for the 94 crime bill. And you're saying F Donald Trump? There's just no common sense here whatsoever.
No, it's a movement waiting for a trigger. It got its trigger, and actually the first one was COVID. People in the movement are idealistic. It's terrible to see someone die at the knee of a policeman, but who ends up taking over, and we saw that in the 60s, are organizers who want government power. That's what happened. I don't like to use foreign analogies, but that's what happened in the 60s. Example, in order to prevent riots, we created a new national community action program, which it sounds like something we're going to get next week from Washington after we defund the police, right? Community action, social workers funded in towns by the federal government. We did that so in the 60s. And there were many fights over that money, and the people who were paid by the federal government were often very radical. That is, it was a jobs program for protesters. And the protesters, therefore, fostered violence in the communities where they were placed and paid by the federal government. It was very perverse. One example, I'm from Chicago, and one example that I learned about in researching Great Society, this book, The police were, well, Chicago police, they were very rough. Many were bigoted. We funded other groups, that is the kind of new police, who were supposed to bring racial justice. There was a vacuum with nobody in charge, and so the federal government ended up funding the Blackstone Rangers, the big gang, to keep the peace on the south side of Chicago, with hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the question is, are vigilantes better than the sheriff? It's a very Western question. Who's better, the new policeman or the old? In Chicago, it was bad for blacks and whites to have a gang with its interests, including, its wars with other gangs, owning the south side of Chicago, and contributed to the departure of taxpayers.
Yeah, that's the question.
That's what happens. You create a vacuum.
Yeah, and that was the question I raised yesterday. I kind of posted my unscripted kind of raw feedback after walking through the protests, and I shared it on Instagram, and it's on our website, montanatalks.com right now. And that was my question. I saw these signs that were claiming to speak for indigenous people, because in Montana it's BIPOC, black, indigenous people of color, that some of these white liberals claim to be speaking for. And I was like, wait a minute, you're claiming to be speaking for indigenous people. Leaders from the Crow tribe and leaders from the Northern Cheyenne tribe are calling for more police on the reservations, not less, not to defund the police. So they're actually calling, when you see these protesters on the left calling to defund the police, they would only create more black victims. So if they truly care about black lives, it's the black lives that would be even more impacted negatively by defunding the police.
That's what the record suggests. And it's what happened in the past. One thing I learned in writing this book, Great Society, about the 1960s, were the private sector efforts. And there was a very interesting effort by Intel, well, the predecessor of Intel, which was Fairchild, to employ Native Americans in New Mexico. And at one point, Intel's predecessors became the greatest private sector employers of Native Americans making chips, because it was very similar to the bead and sewing, weaving work done by the tribe in New Mexico. And eventually that project was killed, a good employment project in a reservation area, by activists. And all those Native Americans lost their jobs because the company was threatened so much it shut down and built its factory somewhere else.
Wow.
So often it's a good story. I never knew it. It's in Shiprock, New Mexico. There are plenty of those stories from the 60s, and what's creepy are the echoes. Nothing is new, it's just forgotten. I think this is happening because we failed to educate our young people, so they don't know the subpar record of movement politics in the United States in fostering change that's useful to people who need help or opportunity.
And they
have no idea.
And there was a lot of young people out. Yeah, there was a lot of young people out at the protest that I saw yesterday. Amity Shlaes, incredible conservative author and commentator that we get the opportunity to talk with here this morning. Amity, you were talking about that project in New Mexico that was great for Native American jobs, and then it ended up getting canceled. So the cancel culture has been around long before Twitter and Instagram and whatever the heck else is out there now. But I was also thinking, as you were talking about how, we have the Crow people here in Montana who want to be able to sell their Crow coal. And so where are all these protesters who claim to want to speak up for BIPOC, for black, indigenous people of color? I don't see them speaking up for indigenous people who are being blocked from economic opportunity by white liberals in Seattle, for example.
Well, you often have a culture of very idealistic people, national, sometimes from universities. That was the 1960s and often now, who aren't aware of the local needs of the situation. And it's a kind of arrogance to walk in and say, I will teach you social theory to help your people, without knowing the needs of Montana, the needs of Illinois, the needs of New Mexico, right? And that's one thing we have in common. Everyone means well, but the people in the national movements tend to be deeply idealistic and really want they're not sure what they want. They want to. We all want to stop people dying unjustly when they do. We don't like to watch evil footage of bad police. But the question is, do we need a whole revolution? And you'll always have weird idealistic advice from people who aren't familiar, kind of trying to cookie cut every town into a fashionable political vision.
Yeah,
template.
you made a good point when we were catching up during the break here as well. The thing that stood out to me from the protests that I walked through yesterday was the signs that say white silence equals violence. Which before you were told that if you're white you're not allowed to say anything about these topics, but now you're being told that you have to speak out or it equals violence. So I guess we're now free. In fact, we're being ordered to speak out now. But you made a point that just the dangers of the First Amendment truly being under attack right now, and just the lack of the marketplace of ideas. Senator Tom Cotton out of Arkansas, Iraq War veteran, had an op-ed in the New York Times, and now it caused this whole dust-up at the New York Times. The opinion editor resigned. Apparently all the young reporters that they're trying to get on the cheap at the New York Times are outraged because they're part of the cancel culture, and so it's causing a big fury at the New York Times.
Well, yes, I think we need new institutions. Those of us who are working on building institutions, I'm building the Calvin Coolidge Foundation, because Coolidge was just a real hero of common sense. And need to do that because older institutions are having trouble handling this. This also happened at the Philadelphia Inquirer over a single headline. People should not be bullied. I'm not saying that there should be an argument where one side says one thing and the other says the other. We need to have a national discussion. And right now, even expressing skepticism has a terrifyingly high penalty in the media. Even trying for balance has a terrifyingly high penalty in the media. The worst penalty I've seen in my adulthood, and I'm old. So what is the cost of that? People have to be brave and just say the truth, or at least permit themselves to ask questions. Younger people should realize they're policing themselves, and that in order for us to solve what problems we have in our towns, we need frank discussions where no one is punished for trying out an idea.
Exactly. Well, very well said. Amity Shlaes, always a pleasure to get to talk with you. Thanks so much for taking some time out with us this morning.
Thank you. And economics are often the answer, free markets and classical liberalism.